Hello, Book 2. David Wiley and I are doing apparently a two-person read-along of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Two Towers. We decided to start a read-along in amidships. This is The Two Towers is the second part of The Lord of the Rings. And we are skipping a read-along of The Fellowship of the Ring. We may come back around and do it someday, but I think David probably had in mind a video a week since he's really busy. He's got a family and a job and whatnot. But I can't help myself. I don't know if he's okay with it. I'm hoping that he is. But I can't help myself talking about these individual chapters. So that is what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the third chapter of the Two Towers, which is sort of the well, we've already seen some action, right, in this second book of There's the Bean, but we haven't seen as much action as you would think, considering that this is the midpoint of an epic fantasy. The first chapter was the departure of Boromir, where our three main characters, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, Aragorn comes upon a dying Boromir. He learns a crucial fact, which is that Boromir tried to take the One Ring from Frodo by force. Frodo fled from him. Boromir came to his senses, tried to protect the young hobbits Merry and Pippin from being abducted by a gigantic band of orcs, and he failed. He killed a lot of them, but they end up killing him. And what follows after that, in that chapter, is Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli basically giving Boromir a funeral. And then they decide that what they must do, the Fellowship has been broken up, Frodo and Sam are heading alone into Mordor. They decide what they must do morally is simply go and rescue Merry and Pippin, or at least try. So they do. That's their decision. That's all of that book. That's all of that chapter. Then the second chapter is The Riders of Rohan, which mostly follows our characters, our three characters, as they go on an epic chase on foot. They don't have any horses. They go on foot on an epic chase of those orcs who have a huge head start. And they scarcely rest, but that's enough to give the orcs a huge head start because the orcs aren't resting at all. As they make a straight line for Isengard, the headquarters of the wizard Saruman, who is the one giving them orders, although Sauron, the Dark Lord in Mordor, also wants the One Ring. He also wants halflings, hobbits, delivered to him. So the band that abducts Merry and Pippin is composed of two kinds of orcs. One, the Uruk-hai, a kind of orc that Saruman has basically created in Isengard through ways that nobody really wants to think about. Nobody really wants to contemplate how he can come about getting tougher, taller, and smarter orcs. But also orcs from Mordor who want to deliver this ring to Sauron, and halflings to him as well, to torment and to learn all about. It's an uneasy band, in other words. It's likely that they will come to grief. And in the course of the Riders of Rohan, the beginning of the Riders of Rohan, we get some hints that there is dissent in the ranks of those orcs themselves, that they aren't one happy band. And Aragorn also finds traces that the hobbits, at least for a while, were alive. And they keep going. Except for very brief stops, they keep going to chase after those orcs. It is, as we are told, an epic feat. They run 135 miles in a little more than 3 days. That's an epic feat to do for when you weren't planning on doing it, when you weren't training for it. It's an epic thing. It doesn't close the gap. It can't close the gap. The orcs are not resting at all. But something else happens. The orcs encounter riders of Rohan. They encounter armed horsemen of Rohan, and they are destroyed. The whole band is destroyed. And the band then meets Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli and tells them that. The leader of the band is Éomer. And he tells them that we encountered the orc band you're chasing and we left none alive. So if your friends were in that band, they're dead. But we didn't see anything that wasn't an orc. Éomer is stunned to learn everything that they have to tell him. He is stunned to see a dwarf and an elf in Rohan. He is stunned to have Aragorn revealed to him as the lost king of Gondor, the returned king of Gondor. He is stunned that they ran 135 miles in 3 days, 3 days of change. That is unbelievable to him, and so on and so forth. But he lends them horses because they're intent on seeing for themselves. So they get 2 horses and they ride off. Still on the trail of the orcs, but now it's a dead trail. They know that the orcs are not alive. And that's it for that chapter as well. Not a whole lot of action. Not really. The plot is moved forward in very expert ways. And then we come to chapter 3, which is called the Uruk-hai, and which does something on a small scale that Tolkien is going to do on a huge scale in just a few chapters. This is sort of him testing the ground, which is to completely switch narrative. He completely switches the narrative focus in this chapter. You see the departure of Boromir, and then you see the Riders of Rohan, and you know what the next chapter is going to be. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are starting to think that the hobbits have made their way into Fanghorn Forest. It seems to be the only way to them that they could have escaped the notice of the Riders as they were killing the orcs. You figure the next chapter will be those 3 entering Fanghorn Forest, and it isn't. Instead, Tolkien shifts the narrative to Merry and Pippin in the midst of the orc band carrying them to Isengard. And in order to do that, he has to shift not only the narrative focus, but also the temporal focus. He has to go back into the past. So we're reading about Merry and Pippin being carried along and pushed along and hurried along by these orcs. And we already know that at one point, one of them is going to break away from the orc band in order to drop a leaf-shaped brooch from Lorien so that Aragorn can find it. He's already found it. So we know that's going to happen. We know that they are alive for a long time. We know that they eat lembas bread. There are crumbs that Aragorn finds. We know that they're not found with the orcs. And knowing all that, Tolkien takes us into their experiences, which are pretty horrific. They are described in pretty horrific detail. That they are tormented, beaten, pushed along, carried like sacks of grain over the shoulders. They're given an orcish draught, a kind of golden liquid that it does fill them with a kind of junky, fiery energy, but it's pretty awful. It makes them feel pretty awful. And they are always thinking about escaping, but it seems impossible. The only chance they might have, they think, is that all is not well in this band of orcs. This is 2 bands of orcs, the Uruk-hai and orcs from Mordor, who are represented in this chapter. The orcs talk. They're not animals. They talk. They talk amongst each other, and they don't like each other. And the fighting Uruk-hai are represented by a character named Ugluk, and the orcs of Mordor by a guy named Grishnak. And they are very much at odds with each other. The fighting Uruk-hai have a very high opinion of themselves, Ugluk most of all. They think they're the ones who do all the hard fighting. They're the ones who do all the heavy work. And they have a mission. We have been told to bring these back to Isengard. Untouched and unspoiled. We learn explicitly that was the instruction. Don't kill them and don't search them. A very key piece of instruction. No more detail than that. At least for the Uruk-hai. Grishnak seems to know more about why you shouldn't search them and about what you would search them for. A key element in the war. Something that he might have to deliver to a waiting Nazgul. And later on in the chapter, Merry and Pippin realize it themselves when an orc starts to search them, starts to rifle through their clothing. They start to realize he knows what he's looking for. He's looking for the ring. He has no idea what halfling he has or doesn't have here. They actually taunt the orc by saying, Gollum, Gollum, and calling it precious. And saying, well, if you want this precious thing that you're looking for, free us. And the orc in question says, well, I can take it from your dead bodies. I could flay you alive. And believe me, you'd rather be dead than alive when you get into the hands of the questioner with a capital Q that you're headed for. You'll pray for death then. And you'll have no secrets then. And we already know what is going to happen to this band of orcs. They are going to become aware that they are being hunted by a band of horsemen from Rohan. And they are. And we do learn that. The band of horsemen is smaller than the band of orcs, but better armed, easily able to defeat them. But they don't tempt fate and fight during the night. Instead, they taunt the band from a distance. A rider will ride in quickly, fire off some arrows to kill some people, and then ride out again. The Riders of Rohan have no idea about the hostages. They haven't met Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli yet. Some of those arrows come close to Merry and Pippin. We could get the accidental death that we actually are worried about having in the previous chapter. That comes close to happening, but it doesn't happen. And sure enough, violence eventually breaks out, and Merry and Pippin are outside its periphery at the time. They have escaped just enough so that when the fighting starts to happen really intensely, they're outside of it already and are free to free themselves, have a little lunch, because they're hobbits, hobbits don't change, and then flee into Fanghorn Forest. So we know that's what they did. And that is the chapter. That is the Uruk-hai, which is fascinating for a whole bunch of reasons. One of those reasons is small. It's tiny. It made me angry. It irritated me. Because I virulently hate Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. I virulently hate that show. I hate it on every level. I hate every decision that was made in it. There are no good decisions that are in it. It is an absolute garbage piece of Twitter politics, of virtue signaling, box checking. It's awful in every way, even the acting, even down to the raw mechanics. There's hardly any good acting performances anywhere in it. It makes fools of great heroes. It makes unrecognizable entities out of famous characters, and all of the invented characters are invented for Twitter political reasons, for social justice reasons. And it shows. In order to adhere to an SJW Twitter politics view of box checking, the showrunners had to indulge in the casual racism that has become completely endemic in the 21st century. In the 21st century, you cannot have a bad guy who's a black man. All of your villains must be white, which I've been trying to put Rings of Power entirely out of my mind. Of course, in Rings of Power, all the orcs are chalk white. They don't look. The orcs in Peter Jackson's movies are neither black nor white. They are fantasy creatures, as orcs are. But in the Rings of Power, they are ostentatiously white, because they can't be anything else. They can't be dark colored. They can't even have dark clothing, because of racism. And that bothered me at the time because of the posturing that it is and how predictable it was. But reading this chapter, the Uruk-hai, it bothered me even more because the orcs refer to the riders of Rohan as whiteskins. Now that you might say that's repulsive, offhand, unthinking racism on the part of Tolkien himself, and you might be right about that. Who knows? I'm not willing to defend every single societal position that Tolkien had, but it means that chalk white orcs are a flagrant violation of continuity. That whether you like it or not, it's right there on the page. It's not even open to interpretation. The orcs refer to men as whiteskins, which means two things: that the orcs themselves are not whiteskins, and that there are no black people in Middle-earth. But be that as it may, the orcs are fighting with each other as much as they are with this band of Rohirrim until it's too late. And then they are all destroyed. But we know, reading this chapter, what we already knew, which is that Merry and Pippin were not among the dead. You know already that Tolkien is not going to have that happen. And we believe Éomer. He might not understand what's going on with these legends popping up out of the grass, but he knows his craft. He knows that he didn't leave anyone alive and he didn't miss anyone. And it turns out he didn't. And that's this chapter. That's all that it is the adventures of Merry and Pippin. There's a wonderful little detail at the end of it when Merry and Pippin are out of it. They know that the fighting's not going to conclude them. They are untied and free, and they have a little food in their belly. And they are now making their way into Fanghorn Forest, and Tolkien goes out of his way to say that if you'd listened to them chatting with each other, you'd never have guessed the ordeal they've just been through. Oh, it's my own little Uruk-hai. Hello, babe. Oh, she's pretty. Do you want to come down here? Is that what you're fussing for? There you go. She does. She does yoga when she gets down off the couch. She's stretching elaborate when she gets down off her perch. But she's missed being up there. It's been too cold for her to be up there. Even with the heat on in here, it's been too cold for her to be in a windowsill. Now it's not anymore, so she's been up there all day. But anyway, that's it. That's a lovely note at the end of this, that Tolkien keeps the hobbits in hobbit character all throughout. He has them eat, for instance. And he also... Hobbits aren't deeply reflective. They are a kind of a merry folk, stubborn and tougher than you think. They go through this ordeal without and are able to brush it off the minute they're better, which is kind of neat. And that's it. That's where the chapter ends. So that's where we are so far in our Two Towers read along. I am reading chapter by chapter, which I think is probably a breach of etiquette. But that's all that happens here. We learn a lot in this chapter. We learn about the orcs, for instance. We learn that they have language and thought and are capable of sarcasm and innuendo. And we also learn how much they know and don't know about the plans of their masters and a little bit of what those plans are. We definitely know that Saruman is playing his own game. He is working against both the free men of the West and also Sauron. If we didn't guess that before, we now have it literally from the horse's mouth. We have it from servants who have been sent on conflicting errands. But it doesn't matter because all those servants die. So the story progresses in the next chapter. I will probably talk about it. I don't know if I'll do this for the whole of the Two Towers, but I will probably talk about it. So we will move on then, maybe tomorrow. I'll send a cringing apologetic email to David Wiley and hope that he allows it. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. So I will wrap this up and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.